Today, folks, what I'd like to do is go over succession and a few of the biomes, and then especially the aquatic biomes, and talk about the intertidal zones and review some of that information. Just touch on a few terms that before your test next week that I want to talk about a little bit more. So we'll start off here with succession, and we talked briefly about succession being a change over time, and I put a video up that you could see, the Bozeman biology video that you could see the idea of succession. And there's two major types, primary and secondary. And basically primary is the norm. What typically happens in an ecosystem, if humans don't touch it and don't do anything with it, it's what the ecosystem will become over a very long period of time. It's very slow and it's very gradual. And what will happen, if you look in this diagram, you'll see here that you start with what's called a pioneer species. And the pioneer species is the first organism to kind of make that biome its home. So usually what you're going to see here, it's going to be grasses and weeds and wildflowers, very small organisms. And over time, eventually those weeds start to grow into some perennial plants and maybe some a little bit taller grasses. And then eventually over more time, that's very gradual, we start to get some shrubs that start to form, and then possibly into some small trees. And eventually we end up with what's called the climax community, which is the end result of that biome. Now, in our area around here, our end result climax community are deciduous trees, and that's where it will end. It won't move beyond that because that's kind of the top end of our mode of succession. If we allow it to occur. If we get down in the desert, it's not going to be deciduous trees just because of the climate. So there it's going to be cacti and succulent plants, so they don't have as much succession to go through. If you're in the tropical rainforest, it's going to move past just deciduous trees and to move into many types of life. So the climax community is the end result, and it's always a little something different depending on the biome you're in, but it really determines what the biome is what is that final climax community. But they all start with the pioneer species. Now, we also have secondary succession that happens much faster, and this usually occurs after natural disaster, like around here if we have fire or floods, or if you're in a volcanic area, or some other form of major disaster like a typhoon or a hurricane, or even farming could be considered this. So if you go out and you plow up a field, but then if you come back and you just decide the next year you're not going to use that for farming and you just let it go, now you're going to have secondary succession. And because we had pre-established organisms in that area, it comes back much faster. And this is why when you see like burning off a farm field or burning off a CRP area, it doesn't take years and years and years for that to come back. It actually starts sprouting up right away and very quickly. So that's the basic idea of succession. So here you see the pioneer species, lichens and mosses, eventually turns into some grasses and weeds, maybe some shrubs over time, and then eventually some smaller trees that start to form, and then you get a well-established forest in the long run. All right. Then the next thing I want to just review is using a little different PowerPoint is from your book is just the different biomes that we have out there. And we talked about the tropical rainforest in class where it's hot, it's wet, it has very poor soils, but it has a lot of diversity within it. There's also a tropical dry forest out there that's hot, but it has wet and dry seasons. It's not wet all the time. And there's lots of plants in this, and the soils are a little bit better because of that hot temp. It allows it time to kind of break down some of those organisms, some of those nutrients get back into the soil. But both of these areas have a lot of biodiversity. Then we move into the tropical savanna. Tropical means that it's going to be warm all the time. In the savanna, we're going to have some seasonal rainfall, but the soils get compacted. And because the soils get compacted, we don't get trees. We only get tall grasses, which makes it a savanna. We move from there into the desert where we have very low precipitation. And typically what you're going to see is dramatic hot days and pretty substantial cold nights too. So big range of temperature differences during the day. And these are organisms that are adapted to low water levels like cacti and reptiles. We then move into the temperate areas. This means that there are seasons occurring. And the temperate grasslands would be like in Iowa around here or Nebraska, where warm summers and cold winters, but the soils are really fertile and it's mostly grasses growing there because the soils, again, are hard, so trees' roots don't like to grow down into that hard soil. We then move into what we call the temperate woodlands or shrublands. Your book calls these as chaparrals, where it's hot, dry summers. You have a cool, moist winter. It's kind of on the verge of moving between a grassy area and a desert type area. It's shrubby. There's a few shorter evergreens, but the soils are really compact because of those hot and long dry summers that they have, and the winters just don't create enough moisture for them. When we talk about a temperate forest or deciduous forest, cold winters, warm summers, this is what we have here. We have very good soil because those winters kill off a lot of stuff and put a lot of that nutrient back into the soil. We then move on to the coniferous forest biome or the boreal. This is the area where we have quite a bit of precip, usually in the form of snow during those cold winters. Because of those cold winters, deciduous trees don't do very well because they can't create enough photosynthesis to keep themselves alive. So they become coniferous trees or evergreen trees that have cones that bear the seeds that are protected a little bit more. But here you got to go to northern Minnesota, southern Canada to find coniferous forest biomes. And then you move north of that and we get into the tundra where the ground is permanently frozen, so no roots are going to grow in there, so very little vegetation, definitely no trees. They have very short summers that last just a few weeks and then cold winters that are long. And the soil obviously is really poor since it's permanently frozen. All right, so here you see a little map. You can pause right now if you want to kind of look around and just look at all those different types of forests. This one actually even mentions the chaparrals that are, kind of occurring over here on the west coast in some of the areas of Australia. But just take a look at that. When we get into the aquatic biomes, we know that it's the Earth is covered 75% by water. Some of that is fresh water, some of it is marine or salt water, and usually everything's classified by either their depth, whether they're flowing, what's their temperature, and then is it salt or fresh water. So when we talk about freshwater biomes, only about 3% of all the Earth's water is fresh, and only 1% is available. The rest of it is kind of locked up in glaciers or areas we can't get at it. Most of this is found underground. It's not the water in the lakes around us that we can visually see, but it's in the aquifers running under the ground by percolation. There's two main types of freshwater: flowing water, rivers, streams, creeks, and standing water, like our lakes and ponds, and they just differentiate by their size and their depth. You always have plankton or algae growing in all aquatic biomes, so we'll see that. Um, One type of aquatic biome or freshwater biome is a wetland, and the wetlands are really good because they purify our water and remove pollution. They also slow flooding because water runoff, it'll soak into those areas, so they act like a sponge. They're also a great habitat for lots of organisms. Um, Usually when we talk about wetlands, we can either talk about bogs, marshes, or swamps. Basically, a bog is when it's full of dead plant and animal material we call sphagnum moss. If it's a flooded forest, basically, we call that a swamp. And then if there aren't as many trees, then we call it a marsh. We have areas where fresh and salt water meet, which are called estuaries, where a very specific group of organisms live that don't like fresh water necessarily, don't like pure salt water environments or ocean water, so then they live in between in what we call an estuary. When we get into the marine ecosystems, you see a couple of these terms in your review, so I want to make sure to mention them. Just keep in mind that the ocean's so deep, sunlight does not penetrate all of ocean water. So eventually, as you're scuba diving and you go down deep enough, you will get into what's called an aphotic zone where light doesn't penetrate. In the photic zone up on the surface, which will go down quite a ways, maybe in a couple hundred feet, depending on how clear the water is. Photosynthesis can occur in those plankton and algae floating in the water, but eventually we get down to that aphotic zone where there's no light, and then you have organisms that do chemosynthesis, which is like photosynthesis, but instead of sunlight, they use chemicals, and usually you can tell when you're around these because you're going to get a sulfur gas produced, so it's going to smell like rotten eggs. When we talk about intertidal zones, becomes important. When we talk about marine ecosystems, you have an area where the ocean sometimes covers the shoreline or the beach, and other times doesn't. That's the intertidal zone. When we go out a little bit farther, we get into what's considered to be a coral reef area where there's a lot of limestone living animal that creates a great habitat for lots and lots of organisms, and also kind of creates a break before water pounds the intertidal zone, so it slows that water and the ocean tides and the waves down a little bit. We have the coastal ocean, basically is from the continental shelf where eventually the continent starts to drop off. From that point out, which is 90% of the ocean, that's the open ocean where it gets really deep. And then on the very bottom of the ocean, anywhere along there, even from the intertidal zone through the coral reefs, through the Open ocean, that's considered the benthic zone, where typically there's not a whole lot of light in those areas, and you get a whole other group of organisms that are usually decomposers, or what we call saprobes, that digest dead and dying material that's floated to the bottom of the ocean. So here you see an area of an intertidal zone. This was once covered by water, but then the ocean tide went out, and then you have a whole group of organisms living in that tide pool. We talk about coral reefs being an abundant area for life, but they also are an animal. They filter our water out. So we usually see, when you see like the tip of this is bleaching, where it should be this color or even brighter like these. We see that bleaching effect, which means that those are the water is polluted, and we're having some issues in there. Lots of vegetation within the ocean, lots of oxygen is produced in the ocean because of the plant life. And then we get some of these creatures like these, where we look at shrimp and different types of worms that are in the ocean, aquatic worms that are bottom feeders, crabs and lobsters, things like that also are what we consider benthic zone organisms, and they digest material in the ocean. All right. About the only other thing that I'd like to show you is that you also have this PowerPoint in there just to take a look at. And this is just a quick review of some of those biomes that we already talked about. So just flip through this. You see some of the major factors affecting biomes. Remember, we also kind of can see, here's a little chart that shows you differences in latitude and moisture levels within there, and shows the different biomes in that chart. We talk about these major different types of biomes. We see the rainforest, what that would look like. We see the tropical dry forest. There's a little bit of a change, not quite the diversity in the dry forest. The tropical savanna, where we have the grasses and very sparse trees. Temperate deciduous forest, this looks like our backyard. Temperate rainforest, this would be like in areas where we get really dense vegetation, in Florida maybe, where it's not quite as hot, so it can't be considered tropical, but it's there. We have temperate grasslands, where we have seasonal weather that is occurring. We have deserts, in which you have very low precipitation and also cold and hot weather. You have taigas, which is a coniferous forest biome, which can also be called a boreal up north. And then we have frozen water areas that are considered to be, or frozen soil areas that are considered permafrost, like in northern Canada and close to the poles. And then just take a good look at this biome chart, because it will give you some ideas of some of the major characteristics. About a few of the only other terms that you just want to check into your book about, look up and make sure you know what bioaccumulation, which is a form of pollution that occurs. Talk about greenwashing, which is kind of a false advertising that companies do to make them look like they're eco-friendly, but they're really not. There's a section in your book talking about that. They also talk about urban sprawl and just how that's affecting our biomes as those pass out in the organism. So hopefully that helps you out a little bit before the test next week, and we will see you on Tuesday.